Hi. So I was on this slide when I was rudely interrupted by the video having to stop. So the one wonderful thing about me always just doing these 15-minute videos is that even if I get all excited and I want to go a little longer, the videos are only up to 15 minutes, so I have to stop. What I was seeing, though, was on this arterial end, we're always going to have a higher pressure inside the blood to push fluids out than we will have to pull fluids back. Because if you have a lot of fluid and you have a lot of solutes and they're mixed together, the amount of fluid inside is going to be higher still than the amount of fluid outside. On the other end, though, you've lost all that fluid, so now you have less fluid inside, but you still have the same amount of solutes. So those solutes are going to have a higher pull on the venous end, which is why we're going to pull fluids back in on that venous end. Okay? No. Didn't I have a video on here? Okay. I thought it was that's weird. It's really weird. Always low. Here we go. Here's a fluid exchange across the walls of capillaries. Video from McGraw-Hill.
At the arterial end of the capillary, the net filtration pressure is equal to the net hydrostatic pressure minus the net osmotic pressure. The net filtration pressure is 13 millimeters of mercury. This causes fluid to move from the capillary into the interstitial fluid. At the venous end of the capillary, the net filtration pressure is equal to the net hydrostatic pressure minus the net osmotic pressure. The net filtration pressure is minus 7 millimeters of mercury. This causes fluid to move from the interstitial fluid into the capillary. Approximately 9/10 of the fluid that leaves the capillary at its arterial end re-enters the capillary at the venous end. About 1/10 of the fluid passes into the lymphatic capillaries and returns to the bloodstream via the lymphatic system.
Okay. Oh, wait, there we go. So, just like the video said, the lymphatic system is very important in picking up excess liquid that did not go back to the blood. This liquid, this fluid, goes through lymphatic capillaries and enters the lymphatic system. And what the lymphatic system does is it makes sure that there are no pathogens in the fluid, and then it returns the fluid back to the blood. That's a major function of the lymphatic system. We'll be talking about this in our next 2 chapters. So then, what is blood pressure? The blood pressure is the pressure that blood has against arteries. So the amount of pressure or force it has on the artery walls. Too high of a blood pressure could put so much pressure on the arteries that the arteries could burst, which is why high blood pressure is such a problem. If you have too low of blood pressure, though, then you may not be getting fluid out to the tissues properly. So you're not going to get perfusion to all of your tissues, and things like your fingers, your toes may not get enough nutrients. And so that's a big problem as well. There are different terms that we have to know associated with blood pressure. Systolic pressure is the pressure of the ventricles. So systole, in a nutshell, is the contraction state. And typically when we talk about systolic pressure, we're looking at the ventricular contractions. Diastole is the relaxation phase then. And when we talk about diastolic pressure, we're looking at the pressure associated with the ventricles at rest. So when the ventricles contract, the pressure in the arteries gets very high because all the blood flows out really fast into those arteries. When the ventricles relax, they kind of rest and they're like, oh, done, we're done for a moment. Then the pressure in the arteries also will drop. Not dropped. That's weird. Does that make sense to everybody? And so our typical pressure is about 120 over 80. That's not a bad pressure. You know, it can be 120 over 70. You don't want to go typically with your systolic pressure. You don't want to go too high, so like above 140 is considered high blood pressure. But you also don't want to have it too low. You don't want it to be below 1 or below, I believe it is 90. The diastole, that can go down to in the 60s, but again, you don't want the diastolic number to be too high, above 90 or below about 50. And I do have a video on pressure, which I'll show you in a second. We typically use blood pressure cuffs to help with identifying pressure, and we listen to the contractions of our blood pressure, so at pressure points. We listen to the contractions of the heart through these pressure points, and when we initially hear the pressure, or we hear the first beats, that's going to be our systolic pressure, and then when we stop hearing, that's our diastolic pressure. Let me go back to this so you can see this video that I have.
The heart is a beating muscle that pumps oxygen-rich blood to the body through a network of arteries and veins. What we commonly call blood pressure is the measurement taken when the heart's left ventricle contracts and blood is forced through the arteries. As the blood travels from the heart, it exerts pressure against the walls of the arteries. This is referred to as blood pressure. Blood pressure is used to evaluate the force and amount of blood being pumped from the heart, as well as the flexibility and condition of the arteries. There are two components of a blood pressure measurement. The first is the systolic pressure, which is recorded when blood pressure is at its maximum during contraction of the left ventricle. The second component is diastolic pressure. This measurement is obtained when the blood pressure is at its lowest point, when the heart is at rest between beats. The combined measurement is read as the systolic pressure over the diastolic pressure. Abnormally high pressure within the arteries is called hypertension or high blood pressure. Hypertension is usually diagnosed when blood pressure measurements are higher than 140 millimeters of mercury systolic and 90 millimeters of mercury diastolic on 3 separate occasions. Blood pressure levels between 120 over 80 and 139 over 89 are known as pre-hypertension. These patients should be monitored regularly. Hypertension is linked with many medical conditions, such as atherosclerosis, congestive heart failure, stroke, heart attack, and kidney damage, to name a few. If left untreated, hypertension can seriously damage the heart and blood vessels. The good news is that patients with hypertension can usually control their disease with medication and with changes to diet and lifestyle.
So we have a lot of different pulse points that we can use to identify blood pressure. The main ones, we have a brachial pulse point, a radial pulse point. Those are two of the main ones, and then the carotid pulse point. Those are the ones that we typically are using. But there are other pulse points throughout the body that you can use, especially if you have patients who are on dialysis and so you can't use their arms. You can use legs to identify their blood pressure as well. Venous return then is the amount of fluid that comes back to the heart. And it has to be pretty equivalent on both, oh no, pretty equivalent. It has to be equal on both sides. You can't have more return on one side than the other side. The amount of blood that leaves the heart is going to affect the amount of blood that comes back to the heart. If you have more blood leaving, then you're going to have more blood coming back. And both the right and left sides have to have the equal amounts of blood coming back and leaving the heart. The veins don't have the musculature that arteries do, and so they rely on skeletal muscle surrounding the blood vessels as well as the respiratory system. So this is a skeletal muscle pump, and this is an example of, actually I would look at this and say this would be like your gastrocnemius right here. Usually it's a little tighter looking, but on each side of this blood vessel that runs through the muscle. So when the muscle contracts, that's going to push fluids upwards. And then when the muscles relax, the fluid can pull back down. Every time you walk around, you help blood flow from your legs up towards your heart. When you use your hands, you're pushing blood back to your heart. The more movement, the faster blood will flow back to the heart. The respiratory pump is very similar. When the respiratory system, when we breathe, the diaphragm moves down first. So it contracts, which allows the thoracic cavity to get larger in size, and then our lungs can expand, and that's when we breathe in. Well, that actually can push, so that expansion can allow blood to be free to move around. When it contracts back up, it pushes blood towards the heart. Does that make sense? I said contracts. When it relaxes back, we make that thoracic cavity much smaller, and that's going to push blood around. Does that make sense? So when we breathe, we're putting more pressure on the abdominal cavity, and we're opening the thoracic cavity. When we exhale, the abdominal cavity has less pressure, thoracic cavity has more pressure. That's going to help in moving blood towards the heart as well. So thrombosis is when you get a blood clot in a vein. This can lead to an embolus if the blood clot moves, if it detaches. Typically, thromboses occur in veins when you are not using your legs a lot. Have you ever had surgery or been stuck in one position for a long period of time, and people tell you that you need to move your legs, you need to get up and walk? If you're on a plane, they tell you to take a walk around the plane every couple of hours to get blood flow moving. And the reason for this is when blood pools in those veins at those valves, they can start to form a clot. It's going to be more common in elderly patients or in elderly individuals, as well as in people who already have cardiovascular disease. But if that blood clot forms and then it is released, it can move to our lungs or to the carotid arteries, and it could lead to a complete blockage of blood to different regions of our body, and that can cause death to the individual. Another type of disorder associated with the veins is varicose veins. So varicose veins occur when we have when the valves stop functioning. So the valves become very leaky, and so instead of being closed, where they're like this, they're more like this. And so you can see that there's slight area where blood can go back down. This leads to pooling in blood, and it can lead to very